thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And I could also begin like Marie-Louise did back then. I will definitely miss some people. I will definitely miss some research fields from Austria because, well, there are a few reasons. Austria is a German-speaking country, so we are heavily intertwined with Germany and Switzerland. We all speak German after all, so it's not that easy to discern between Austria, German, and Swiss research. We'll also see that in the research I'll talk about in the next slides. I also tried to structure my presentation in difficulty levels because at first glance, I think historic game studies could be seen as looking good in Austria and everything's fine, but there is always a bit of a hook. Let's start with the easy mode. Which games are talked about in research in Austria? Which games are studied? And that is also only a small part of the whole picture because, well, it seems to be rather broad and successful at first glance. And there is different kinds of research done in Austria in universities, in University of Applied Sciences, so-called Fachhochschulen. I'm also part of some fields here, but I omit myself here most of the time. And we've also different institutions around the country in Salzburg, in Innsbruck, in Vienna, in Krems. So you get the drift that, well, it's diverse. Let's start with role-playing games. And here I mean role-playing in the traditional sense, pen and paper, but also in the digital sense of role-playing video games. There are some people like Franziska Ascher from Innsbruck, as well as Tobias Unterhuber from Innsbruck, and also Lukas Daniel Klausner, who research these kind of games. But the other parts are, I think, a bit bigger, especially memory culture and medievalist games. As memory culture is about World War II, the Holocaust, and all those things. We've already heard back in Poland that that's a quite big research field there. And I think in Austria, it's quite the same. Eugen will tell us definitely something, or at least he's here and he researched heavily in this part. And also he has done some research on horror games together with Arno. And here is the part where I'd say it's difficult to discern between, because that's a project based in Switzerland by an Austrian and German researcher. Well, is it Austrian now? I don't know. I think it is, but it's probably also German. It probably is also Swiss. And the last part is medievalist games with, you might already see a whole lot of games researched there. And I think it's next to memory culture, the biggest thing in Austria concerning research questions, concerning papers produced, concerning especially student and graduate student works who are very interested in these kinds of games. Also only some names in here. And one might also add a fifth category, which I haven't displayed here because of reasons. They're so-called political games or games on politics. Here you could ask the question, why are politics intertwined with historical game studies in here? And well, that's an Austrian thing because in school, history and political education are combined into one subject. Therefore, that's always part of history didactics and therefore most of the time also of historical game studies. All in all, we even have institutionalized game studies in Austria, like the curriculum in Krems. However, that specific program is quite expensive because it's a private university. And there they also teach game studies in general, including topics like gender and diversity. Yet historical game studies are part of it. And there is even a course called History in Digital Games, again by Eugen. Let's go to the more difficult levels, like video mode, games, and education. Games and education is always, again, intertwined board games and digital games. Board games are researched by people like Alexander Preisinger, again, from the Game Lab. Game Lab is a recurrent theme here. Also Christoph Kühlberger in Salzburg, but mainly focused on toys, not board games. And that we come to that again later. And well, the Game Lab is part of the University of Vienna. And they published 2 booklets on this topic. And let's jump into these now. First, the left one is digital video games and analog, digital and analog games concerning politics, so politics simulators. So again, the recurring theme of politics is part of the historical game studies over here. And secondly, video games in teaching history and political education. And we'll go into that a bit further because you'll see the diversity of games which are being addressed for schools or in schools and which can be addressed in schools. And that is possible because the Austrian school curricula pursue a competence-oriented approach. Therefore, games could be quite a powerful tool for teaching. And I say could because they might, but there are problems, as you might know. This may unite all our countries and also our different universities and schools because there are always 2 limiting factors. First, there's the time factor. Second, there's the money factor. Time, as curricula challenge teachers with quite a tight schedule. There is often not that much time to focus on a game, and especially there's mostly no time to play a game. And there is also nowhere in the curriculum where it says we should look at historical video games. It's more, we have an own course for media competence, but that's quite new and we don't really know where that'll go or even if games are part of that. Secondly, money. We have already heard about that back a few presentations ago. Technical equipment in schools, technical equipment in universities are scarce. They either don't exist. They might even be not powerful enough to play current games. But there are some approaches which could be promising for every one of us, such as landable consoles, which might offer an interesting perspective, or the whole part of smartphones and free-to-play games, which, well, don't cost a thing, and most students do have smartphones. So it might be even interesting for further research or further use in schools than AAA games. Now let's go back to the whole part of video games as a bit problematic in Austria. This is a temporary exhibition from the town I'm living, at least working, Salzburg. We have a temporary exhibition there called Playing with Games, or Mit Geschichte spielen in German. It is opened for the public just now. It's called Playing with Games. There might be some video games. Couldn't there be? But well, when I was looking around, at least when I was looking at the concept, there wasn't much. Unfortunately, it reflects the research interests and the project of the organizers, as video games only play a side note in this exhibition. It's more about toys, it's more about traditional playing like Barbie dolls, Playmobil, or Lego. And nevertheless, even here video games do play a certain part. At least a physical box of Sid Meier's Civilization is displayed, or an Assassin's Creed cover. But that's about it. However, a disclaimer, I haven't been there yet, so I could be wrong and they could have added some things, but as far as I know from the concepts from 3 months ago, there wasn't. Still, virtual reality is a thing in Austria in schools, as in higher technical education, they use it to program games or at least museum experiences there. These are schools till 19 years old. And also in universities and museums, they are getting more popular. But still, again, for historic experiences, much less games. But it is a rather exemplary look on historical game studies in Austria. Yes, there is some research, but it's often an afterthought, and also funding is still a problem. We'll get back to the funding issue later. Let's first cover hard mode, the development of historical games. I've called it hard mode because I think the impact of COVID might be visible here, or it might also just be a coincidence, and our federal trade representation, the Wirtschaftskammer, which is an obligatory trade representation, might have lost interest here. Back till 2020, there was even a game development working group founded there. It's still on their website, but it hasn't been updated since 2018. Usually also the Wirtschaftskammer had a booth at Gamescom, but that's a thing of the past. This year they hadn't. At this year's Gamescom, there was no official Austrian representation since, I think, 27 or 2010. I don't really know the exact time. They even had a coding day specifically for video game programming pre-COVID, not anymore. When we look at other sources, we could see that in 2018, we had kind of 87 studios, so quite comparable to Estonia. And also 85% of the studios were small business companies, so less than 10 people. And only one single company had more than 50. So Austrian's game dev scene is quite small, yet somehow alive, as there are numerous other projects which, once again, like gamedev.at, it's not updated anymore since for 4 years now. There still is a Vienna game dev meetup. There still is the group of Game Dev Graz by Johanna Pirke, which who organizes meetups, game jams. They even have their own conference, like the GDC, the Game Development Conference, called Game Dev Days, where they're inviting game developers of around Austria for speeches, for postmortems of their games. But it kind of exists, but it's not that flourishing as it could be. So now I've talked about games as a whole, but is there any history in these games which we're talking about? And I'm now picking out some games. First of all, by Mipumi Games in Vienna, Flower Collectors, based in Barcelona, 1970s. We are playing a handicapped former policeman, a dog, because we are anthropomorphic animals in these games, who witnesses a murder from this balcony. It's set in the 70s in Spain during the fascist dictatorship of Francisco Bahamonde or Franco. So yeah, there is some history in games. It might not always be Austrian history as most games had before, but there are also some other projects of this company, like The Lion's Song, which was a narrative adventure game set against the backdrop of early 20th century Austria back in 2017. So there is also Austrian history visible. And this company by Gregor, is kind of the front runner in these things, because they also work with machine games on their Wolfenstein series, or at least the next project, whatever that is. Could also be Indiana Jones, we will see. And also Skull and Bones by Ubisoft. They are kind of contractor company who support other studios in their big games. Another bigger company is Bonkfish, which is again exemplary of games in Austria, because they just in big quotation marks developed a game mode for World of Tanks, still one of the most famous or most successful free-to-play games out there, called Frontline. But I think that's more or less the good news, because there's also some bad news. In the last few years, many branch offices shrunk or were even closed. Even Microsoft or Ubisoft shrunk their offices in Austria. The former biggest studio, Sproing Interactive, closed a few years ago. And now, at least it should be now, there's no real year in there. According to Videospielen.at, 76 active game studios are now available in Austria, so it shrunk for 11 studios, unfortunately. Now let's up the ante a bit to nightmare mode. What's about research of game history? I've already said a museum, and I could just add a blank stare, because there is near to none. I've mentioned a special exhibition in the Salzburg Museum before, and there was also a special exhibition in the Museumsquartier in Wien, called Serious Fun, Architecture and Games. So there is some. It was till September, so unfortunately not available anymore. But there are no archives, at least that I found of. There was an archive called Game Lab a few years ago, I think an article of 2013, but the website isn't available anymore. And unfortunately, that's it. We have no real archivization of Austrian games, even though game companies like Sunflowers, the Anno creators, are based in Austria, were based in Austria until they were bought. And then the last one, a Dark Souls difficulty mode, unfortunately, funding. I've made a small spoiler in this beginning. All in all, Austrian historical game studies do look good, don't they? Well, not anymore when we're talking about it. I'd like to look at some traditional funding possibilities, like the Austrian Research and Development Fund, called the FWF, or the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the Austrian pendant of the thing where you're sitting there in Prague, or the Austrian National Bank, or even some regional funding. All of them not that good, well, depending on money. So yeah, well, you know politics in Austria, probably. We had some slashes on funding concerning science, concerning research. So there isn't much there. And also it's quite, they are quite traditional funding sources. So you might have a chance with digital humanities, but you won't have much chance with game studies. So I'd propose to get historical game studies done here, and maybe even as a suggestion for everyone out there who tries to do that and doesn't have backing like in other countries where game studies are a thing, like Finland or something. How about we flag historical game studies as digital humanities in an offensive way? Because we are dealing with digital sources, we are dealing with digital methods. We could just label that as a digital humanities approach, and that's it. Because that doesn't exist as far as I know. Digital humanities don't really see digital games as part of them. I know of a UTB book in German by, I think, Christine Gundermann, where games are something in there, but not that really present. And well, that might be a thing. And interestingly, just during our workshop, a new funding call was opened called Digital Cultural Heritage in Austria. But again, it could be an Austrian thing because it was on extremely short notice, only 2 months time to go for projects around till 300,000 euro. So again, not that big of a funding, and also 2 months time for quite some work. So that's that for the Austrian part. And I'd like to just say that as we are part of the Austrian of the German-speaking area, there is the Arbeitskreis. Let's call it just the Arbeitskreis, the AKGWDS, who do these things, and Eugen and me are over there. And if you have any questions on Austria or game studies in a whole in the German-speaking area, just hit us up. Thank you.